You are listening to Seeking the Hidden Thing with Kryptos. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Seeking the Hidden Thing podcast. Thank you for joining us. I have my friend Spoon here, Aristocratic Utensil. This is one of these things where the internet has thrust some of us together, and you end up with ongoing conversationalists. And Spoon and I are a pair where we chat for some portion most days, which is just kind of fun. And we often have a lot of very interesting conversations. And we've probably said on more than a dozen occasions, we should sit down and record some of this. And so now we're finally doing it. You, by the way, as an audience, have missed out on 45 minutes of conversation that didn't get recorded. So I don't know whether we're going to recap. It's been that long.
Damn. We are very good at procrastination now.
Yeah, so we've been, like I said, I thought, hey, we should hit record a couple times. It's like, yeah, let me just finish this point. And there we go.
And then 2 hours later.
Yeah, there we go. Exactly.
Yeah, there you go.
Which is how most of our Twitter DMs, end up going that way.
Yeah, even the Rumble streams that we've done is kind of that same vibe. It's just a conversation, and the recording is not even really there. It's more just like, yeah, it's kind of an afterthought. We just roll. That's right. And one of the things that we've been talking about lately is this question of what is the right wing anyways? Is there even such a thing? Does it even exist? And I'm skeptical. But you have some thoughts on this, or I was going to say time, but Spoons. But so what for you in your mind would you say is the right wing? What is this whole thing anyways? Someone would ask me, what does it mean to be right wing?
Yeah.
I would say the main thing, okay, so if I were to contrast it with what's right and what's left, I would say the right is things that stay static and are true, whereas the left is a constant state of trying to change it. So I would say sort of a right-wing perspective is what are the things that you value that you wish to keep that are staples of your civilization. Like right-wing for me is absolutist, and left-wing is not. Curtis, I think a line that I like by Curtis is right is like the absence of left, which I think is actually a fairly good definition. It helps if you know what left is, but you can sort of look at it and go, the right-wing is not that. And so go on.
We could probe at this a little bit though, because there's a clever way to look at it. I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think that you're onto something there. But before we get there, I think we need to maybe grapple with the argument. This is one that Augusto Del Noce made, is that left-wing progressivism today is the tool, the mechanism that's used to maintain a stable political order, in a sense that
in today's society,
the current political order, if you're looking to say preserve an order, which is sort of falls somewhat into the definition that you're using, progressivism today becomes the mechanism by which the current ruling class preserves the present order.
Okay, so
by attacking the enemies of that order, which are traditionalists, as in a sense being anti-progress. So you maintain this progressive order that's looking to manage society towards utopia, but it's the same people who have been in charge now roughly, since the rise of the merchant classes. So, since the 1800s, you have the same sort of rough, stable class who have been large, and perhaps going back to the early maybe the Reformation and slightly before that. The influx of the printing press, let's say, that might be the way to demarcate a hard line. But there has been this idea of attacking a previous traditional order to establish a new stable traditional order, I think has been the project of the bourgeoisie for quite some time now. but I'm not necessarily convinced that it's stable. But that, in a sense, I think is the argument that you might use to say, like, you know, in a question then is, I guess the question comes down to what I'm trying to say is that it's a big way of saying, like, then what is a stable order then? Like, how would you describe a stable order? Because in a sense, the modern bourgeoisie are using progressivism to establish a stable, or at least to guard the stable order that they have created. But is there something different from our present stable order that you would then argue is a different kind of stable order that would then be the embrace of this is actual conservatism?
In the current order?
Yeah, like, is there something, is there like, yeah, like, is the current order actually something stable? Maybe that's the better question
then. No, I don't think so. And I think the reason for that
either, but yeah.
Yes, probably for different reasons. By the way, it's curious to me that you thought the printing press was like the biggest one. I think the equivalent for the printing press in modern, okay, well, I'll say modern times, like let's just say like a last century and a bit, I would say is recorded audio and radio. I would almost think radio is more impressive than the internet from like a historical perspective. The reason I say that is because the concept of hearing somebody else's voice that is not in the room with you is insane. Like, if you just think of that in the perspective of human communication and information sharing with a human being that is not in the room with you. I think if you were to say to someone like in the 1700s, you can communicate with somebody on the other side of the country instantaneously, that's like frame breaking. Yes,
but I think that it needs it. It absolutely is. Okay, so here let's frame this for the audience, right? So this is why, you know, you need to get outside of, say, sometimes the quote unquote canon of right wing books to read some other stuff. But there's an author called Walter Ong, and he wrote a book called Orality and Literacy. And so what he did in this book, Orality and Literacy, is he looked at the development from the shift from a culture of primary orality through to one that is literate. Now, the interesting thing is, at the tail end of the 1800s, early 20th century, there were still a fair number of primary oral cultures, or cultures that were almost like they had some writing, but were almost entirely oral. And so you still, even in the 20th century, had places where they could do proper epic poetry. And you could record it on like a tape recorder, right? So the culture, the people themselves, and these were some, not just necessarily like African places, but they were like remote villages in Slovenia and stuff, where they were still primarily oral cultures. And so they were living adjacent to a modern society. They were, you know, you'd largely consider them quote unquote Western, but like Western peasant culture. And they were primarily oral. So what Ong did is he highlighted a whole number of the characteristics of this oral culture, but then notes that when you introduce the technology, first of all, of writing, now writing has its effects, but if you have just handwriting stuff, it doesn't have the same kind of effects as when you get to the printing press. Plato was already noting the effects that writing had on Greek culture, in a sense, the loss of memory, the way that it undermined the ability to recall the epic poems, these types of things. So he was, you know, just the way it attacked memory. The other thing, when you get then to the printing press, that Ong notes is that it creates a separation between yourself and ideas. So when you can take an idea and put it on paper, it's now outside of yourself. You can look at it. It becomes a thing, an object that you can study. It has a kind of fixity. And the words, you know, you're no longer reliant just on memory. And then once you can do that, it affects a whole series of cognitive changes within the people who are able to read. And so once you reach a tipping point in society where reading becomes prevalent enough across society, which is made possible by the printing press, these cognitive changes that come about, you know, that enable like greater degrees of abstraction, so sort of like abstract reasoning, you know, all of the things that go along with abstract reasoning, the ability to accumulate knowledge, reflect on knowledge, and all of these series of things, the linearity of it, then enable the emergence of the modern world, right? And so even then, Ong, I think, passed away in the 90s, but he was already beginning. He lived long enough to observe the internet, and he was already then talking about the role that the hyperlink would play in disrupting this literary culture. So our modernity was built by pressing this abstract nature, and authors like Ian McGilchrist have noted this, like the changes in cognition and sort of rational linear thinking, and so this creates the foundation for modernity. But then as you get into modernity and you get all of these machines, like you were mentioning, like radio, television, so you get the return of audio, visual, right? And then combining that with print medium in the internet. So now you have audio, video, the hyperlink, all kind of connected. And so you begin to get, even though people are reading and they're writing and writing is everywhere, you begin to break up the cognitive space that created modernity, which is this sort of abstract, rational, linear way of thinking, very, reason and so forth that goes along with that. And so now you're going to begin to see the breakup of the kind of mind and thinking that created modernity in the first place. So the forms of communication, the new forms of communication that we have now, that they've all been melded together in like online social media type communication, they are slowly or rapidly dissolving the kind of cognitive ability and adaptations that we have that were generated by the printing press. So that's why the printing press becomes the demarcation line. And I think why modern social media are going to be largely the end of modernity that way. So that gets us into a kind of I'm not even sure where we started from here. Oh, tradition and so forth. And yeah. But there we go. That's why the printing press for me is a big demarcation line in terms of where modernity starts.
Right. Okay. So for you, it's the initiation of a very long cognitive change and or decline, depending on how you look at it, I suppose. Whereas I was looking at it more in the sense of human communication and sort of propaganda measures. I would say radio is definitely up there. Okay, so we're essentially arguing two different things.
In the newspaper as well, too, right? Propaganda begins with the newspaper. So the printing press is also then part of that cognitive change in modernity, that as technique breaks down society and abstracts it and rationalizes. This is something we were talking about earlier, and we can get back into this with like the whole left-right thing. That as modernity takes the stuff of tradition, abstracts, rationalizes it, and then reimposes it on society, it becomes a simulacrum. And then people still hunger for the organic of the real thing. And then propaganda, beginning with the newspaper, in a sense, attempts to fill the void that the simulacrum we're creating sort of affects within us, if that makes sense.
It does. But that is a lot to wrap my head around for this time of the day. Normally I'm like kind of whimsical. My brain's like, this is a lot of information, and it's very intense. Like I enjoy it, but it is like an exercise in my head.
It's 9:30 in the morning, Spoons. Like it is like 3:30 in the afternoon there. Like
it's
When does the brain fire up over there?
Well, usually for me, once I'm up at 2:00 in the morning, about 6 in the evening, I would say.
It takes you that long
usually
to get going.
Usually. Well, it kind of depends on if I was writing a video, then what the subject was about. And if it's nice and gentle, then I'm roughly awake about like 3 or 4. But I'm a night owl, so that would be the reason.
There we go. Yeah.
And usually I'm animated by very aggressive things. So when it's like nice and calm but very intense, my brain's like, it's like running very hard but on a treadmill. Like I'm not going anywhere, but I am actually moving. If that makes any kind of sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
so
there is an interesting distinction to get back to the left and the right thing. I would say one of the main things that our current present order is trying to, why I don't think it will work, is because it's trying to make safe certain things by constantly growing the state, all in the name of equality and production, which ironically actually makes the material world worse, which I know doesn't make a lot of sense. I'll try and unpack it. If you look at the behaviors that's being pushed by the state in the name of equality, they're not actually conducive for good material and business either, which is really weird.
Okay, go on. Like, fill that out for people.
Okay, so this is something that I did in the James Lindsay video, is if you look at the things that he proposed that the state accrued for people in the name of equality was not judging people by their race, sex, or sexuality. That's a nice idea in theory, but the problem is nobody judges anybody on those variables. Like, if you ask anyone who doesn't like, say, gays, blacks, Jews, or women, why? They're not going to say because they're gays, blacks, Jews, or women. No, they will give you reasons all based on their behavior. So when you have all of these, you may not discriminate on X, Y, and Z, the reason why that doesn't work is because no one discriminated on those variables to begin with. They discriminated on the behaviors associated with those groups. So the more that you
to clarify. So in other words, the fact that the guy's gay, I mean, once you know, it probably bothers you, right? Because it's people have an aversion to that sort of thing. But if he doesn't tell you, you're not discriminating. But what you're discriminating on him against is his effeminate behavior. So he acts in so if you have a gay guy that basically presents as completely normal and isn't effeminate,
no one cares.
Then nobody cares. I get what you're saying. Okay, so that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah. And that's kind of the weird thing that our society, like, constantly introducing like new rights for different groups, because that's the way it grows the managerial state, and that's the way the state grows in modernity. But it is quite weird in a sort of paradoxical way that is what the state does, and it is all in the name of trying to just grow my GDP, but that doesn't actually help the GDP. So it's sort of like this machine of, like, I'm trying to use one method to get to a destination, but how I get to that destination using the methodology I currently have, it's actually making it worse. And so when you ask me, can you have a stable order? Not what it's trying to do. It seems counterproductive to the point where it's kind of stupid if you just look at it in that kind of sense.
Well, yeah, and this again gets back to the whole question of, like, the left-right split, right? So
yes,
one of the things that, and this comes down to, and this was one of the things that we were noting before recording, is that all modern ideologies are modern ideologies, right? So in this regard, and I think this is the thing that a lot of people, and this is what begs the question of this whole understanding of, like, what is the right, is that this thing that we call the right wing, the left wing, so you would say fascism, communism, liberalism, those are your three big ideologies, that all of them are modern ideologies in a sense that they represent a decisive break from the past. And all of them are a way to use reason, science, and technology to create a better future. So that usually ends up being, so with liberalism, you're looking at, we can create a better future through a combination of economic production, which largely means letting people kind of go about their business as they please and take care of their own affairs. And if you just let people do their own thing and go about their own business affairs and leave them alone and let them be quote unquote free, they will attain the maximum amount of productivity for everybody. That's kind of like liberalism roughly, right? Communism says that no. This whole liberalism thing, it creates inequalities, and this is bad. Because the ideal society is one in which everybody shares in the bounty of the world and production equally. So what we need to do is sweep away the present order, and then once the present order is swept away, we will after an interim period of some careful management, a period of equality will just kind of emerge on the other side. You have to trust us. Right. And then the other group, the fascists, says, like, no. There was a period in the past when we were strong and vital and we were full of life as a culture. And really what we have to do is sweep away the present order and then reinstantiate this vitality that we had, and this will bring in the ideal order. But all of them, and these are very, very, like, I mean, everybody, don't quote me on sort of my characterization of each of the three ideals, but the idea is with each of them that you are using reason, science, and intelligence, because the fascist isn't really grasping at the actual beliefs that were there. What he's doing is he's taking a rationalized form. So he's examined them, abstracted them, and rationalized and said, hey, we can take these as principles and impose them on society again. And then by means of technique and technology, and by imposing these older values on society, we can create a near perfect society, because that's when things were really good back in the old days. And so you get a technologized simulacrum of the past, but you don't actually get the past, right? And then,
or like an axiomatic mythos.
That's right. You don't actually get it. And so what happens is that all three of these ideologies are trapped in kind of a weird dialectic between each other's, a trialectic.
I just realized what you just described. You actually described, like, in essence, your three forms of modern ideologies, which is liberalism is freedom obsessed, communism is equality obsessed, and fascism is like dictatorial or order obsessed, I would say. But
it's a past order, right? So yes,
and
that may be true. But all of them are looking to
compared to the other ones.
Sorry, go ahead.
I would say that the fascism one is more top down, at least openly so. I mean, they all, in essence, are top down because that's all power dynamics. But I would say, this is going to sound kind of weird, but I would think of the three of them, I would say fascist is the most honest.
Yeah, perhaps. And
in terms of
communism as well,
projection.
too, because communism is very clear. Like, we're just going to sweep aside the present order, and then you just have to trust us that the perfect order is just going to emerge once it's swept away. So, I mean, that's fairly straightforward. I can kind of buy that.
I would say, though, the reason I would say fascism more so is because communism is as you theorized, is the eradication of hierarchies, which is just bullshit. Whereas fascism openly tells you there will be a hierarchy.
Yes. Yeah. And then liberalism lives in a kind of lie that, in a sense, is that we don't need hierarchies at all. People can be their own hierarchy.
People could be like benevolent aristocrats, essentially.
Yeah, everybody will kind of run their own affairs. And if we just let everybody kind of if every person is their own king, then things will work out better.
Yes, it's basically Protestantism in an ideology form.
Yes, I would. Yeah. I know, like, being a Protestant, I know a lot of people don't like it when we bag on Protestants, but there is a sense where I think there's some work to be done where Protestants have to own their own, own the contribution that they've had to not just the successes of the Western world, but also its ills.
Yeah, I would say the reason, well, in my opinion, I would say the ills is that society which you just described, the Protestant, everyone can be a king, that can work if all the kings behave in the same way. Then it can work. The same way that, like, an anarchic society can work in the sense that if everyone respects private property rights. That's an ideal. It's very difficult to achieve, but it can be. You're basically trying to, this is going to sound weird, but imagine if you took, I don't know if you've played this game before, but essentially Andrew Ryan's Rapture from BioShock and made everyone Protestants. Basically that's what you're trying to achieve.
The problem with liberalism is that it doesn't account for
the differences
necessity of organic culture formation. So, in a sense,
no, not at all.
Someone is going to be in charge of determining who you are. Like, so somebody is going to impress upon you a set of values. Your parents, the schools, the state, and the state has an interest in impressing upon values upon you. But those values are going to be impressed upon you. Either it's done with your family, your church, your local community, and if those have been disrupted, and they have been, then ultimately it's going to be the state and propaganda that does it to you. But someone is going to impress values upon you, and they don't organically emerged. So the idea that you can just kind of leave everybody alone to grill is in itself, it's built upon a fallacy that people just kind of emerge into adulthood completely and fully formed as healthy, well-functioning liberals who are completely moral, upright, are willing to leave everybody else alone, respects everybody else's space and right, always manages to somehow never step on or harm another person, and yet at the same time pursues their own self-interest. Like the whole thing is it's a kind of an ideal that cannot be instantiated in the real world. And that's the sense of it's an ideal that cannot be instantiated.
It's basically having to go with libertarians, by the way.
Yeah, but I know there's a whole thing of ordered liberty and so forth, but there's a whole set of assumptions that they share, that sort of, the more ordered liberty type stuff, that I think are not always fully expressed.
No, I agree with that. I would think libertarian to me is more like a really good philosophy if everyone is moral and righteous and you were trying to do an economic order. I think libertarianism is very good for that.
But you have to first of all, you have to ask the question of how do you get that order? Yeah, and that's where libertarianism precisely breaks down.
Yeah, libertarianism is not the foundation. It's what you build on the foundation.
No, and in a sense, the thing is by dividing church and state, right, and then having the public-private split, basically there's a kind of sleight of hand that says the idea was in this public realm, we're going to have this liberal society, but nobody says that we really need the private sphere to do everything in its power to make people upright, good, and decent citizens so they can operate in a valueless, neutral public sphere.
Yeah, it's trying to use the values of materialism to make a world where you value more than just material, which doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and you're just kind of slipping it in, like you're slipping everything in through the back door. It's a kind of a sleight of hand. And that's part of the problem. So what happens is that you're trying to create a moral and upright people, but never acknowledge that that's what you're doing. Because publicly you're not allowed to talk about it, but that's supposed to happen in the private sphere, and the state has no business in the private sphere. And so, but at the same time, the private sphere is supposed to be shaping people for preparation in the public sphere, but you're not allowed to carry anything from the private sphere into the public sphere because that becomes religiously dangerous, right? Yeah. So the whole thing just breaks down into kind of there's just all of these contradictions and sleights of hand that in a broad sense, just liberalism, not just American liberalism, but like liberalism writ large just doesn't work because you can't manage all the sleights of hand. So eventually what happens is the state begins to become authoritarian. It says, listen, we need to take care of teaching the kid. Like we need to take on the role of doing the private sphere because we need them to be a certain type of person to operate well in the public sphere. And so it by nature becomes totalitarian in that regard, like a totalizing environment.
I would say, I'm kind of curious as to know. I think you can have that ideology, but I think what makes the state grows is the differences between people as it is trying to fraction them and grow the state. So I feel like if you had a sort of like a Frederick the Great of Prussia kind of environment where you had your enlightened despots, which is that you can embrace the ideas of sort of more liberal ways of being, but there is still one person keeping the excesses of liberalism in check. Because whether people acknowledge this or not, is every civilization you've ever had has that mechanism of you have control from top down. And anyone who says they don't, like if you listen to anyone describe an ideal world and there's no hierarchy of the imposition of values, it's not going to work because that is the function of hierarchy in every human civilization ever. Like from the time you're born as your parents to your local community, there is always something that imposes the order, whether you like it or not. That's just how humans function. Like all mammals function like this.
Somebody is imposing values on you, right? And so,
yes, but that's normal. But I think the reason why it doesn't gel so well in our time, like this perspective, and why it makes people cagey, is because probably post-Enlightenment ideas, there is this perception that self-governance has been effective and we hate our government. And if only they were to just piss off, we would be fine. I don't think that's necessarily true, but that's the sort of lie that people tell themselves to be more anarchic.
Yes. And the sense that, well, okay. So in a sense, what people want to be able to do is they want to be free to indulge in their vices.
Yes.
Without anybody
and be left alone
them.
For it.
Yeah. So the idea, see, here's the part of the problem is that the liberalism is built on the idea of blank slatism, in a sense that
it is, yes,
people,
absolutely.
Right. And so if you take the assumption that people are born flawed, the old religious sinful, the whole thing breaks down, because the idea with liberalism is that, okay, if people are blank slates, which means they're born uncorrupted, then if they enter into a world that has been perfected, then sin and evil will no longer be a problem. So the idea then is that if we can, through technique, perfect society, then everything will be fine, right? People will be born into a world and they'll just naturally emerge into a world that's beautiful. So you get this orientation then where there's no personal moral responsibility that I bear for anything. That everything that needs to be fixed out there, because if it gets fixed out there, then I'm just going to naturally be a good person, right? Because I'm naturally born, I'm a good person anyway. So if there's problems, then, and whatever problems I have, they've been inflicted on me by society, by my parents, my school, whatever, but they've been imposed upon me from outside because I'm basically a good person. And so I'm born a blank slate. So, and this is really the fundamental problem, is that if you have to grapple honestly with the fact that people are not born good. I mean, so the blank slate says, well, if we just properly educate children, then they're just going to grow up and they're just naturally going to be good people, good citizens. Right. And so, whereas if you recognize that there is this thing called original sin, then you have to, as a society, plan for the fact that people are just going to do evil things because they're born tainted with sin, with evil, and that there's going to be a natural inclination to do things that are both bad for them and bad for society.
Yeah, and the reality that is going to be imposed upon them by someone up above, and is also going to have to keep them in line.
That's what the role of the person from up above is. That's what their role is to punish the evildoer,
the wicked. Yeah, white man's burden again, just in a different form. But that is essentially our moral order that we are trying to impose. Actually, I feel like it's more like it's been hijacked by liberals in order to. I would say it's more hijacked by women than it is men. Because men assumes that evil is to be driven out by force, whereas women thinks they can be molded through compassion.
Well, I think it's more. It's not so much molded by. I think that it comes down to. I think Charles Haywood has simplified this down. Men tend to drive society forward. And one of the things that Ong notes with men is they tend to be on the perimeters of society. So what the men do is they tend to establish boundaries and protect them, right? So they create boundaries so you can have, you create a boundary and you establish a territory where there's enough food, safety, and protection that you can, raise the next generation of people, right? So that you can maintain families. And so the men are out there on the boundaries, establishing and maintaining those boundaries. Whereas the role for women is to generally bind society together. So compassion, forgiveness, all of these types of things are a way to heal fundamental breaks, right? So the masculine would say, we need to cast this person out and make them an outcast, right? And then you send them outside of the circle of kind of protection beyond the boundaries to go, live in the outside world beyond where society is. So men are tasked with enforcing those boundaries. Now, women will also make men, the sharp end of the spear, so to speak, because they send the men out to the boundaries to protect their inner space, right? Where they can then raise children. So there's this kind of tension. But with women, they're developing this inner space. And so they're looking to bind society together And so these notions of, I think, and that's why I think some of these compassion things seem more feminine or whatever, is because they're looking to, rather than to send people out and away, as us, they're looking to heal the bonds, restore them, and bring people back together and reunite them. If that makes sense.
Yeah, but I think in our modern times, that perception is very much abstracted past just the social circle of their own. It's now become like a globalized phenomenon for women to care. Primarily, I blame feminism for that kind of crap, now, to be honest. Because like if you look at the kind of people they wish to save, it's like they're not even your kin. I think it's because they're lonely and single, and so they become mothers to everything that is around them.
Yeah, I think there's a case that can be made for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that the mother impulse then gets applied broadly to society. Because again, here's going back to the same thing, that you no longer have children of your own. So now you create an abstract simulacrum of the child. And so you have an abstract simulacrum of the tribe and the family that you're trying to hold together. And so you create all of these simulacrums of your children, so to speak, that you need to then, bind together and heal and keep together, the peace in the tribe.
I do think that is just the nature of women in general. I was reading a post by a guy, and I think I have it saved in my favorite somewhere on Twitter. And he said that there's been parts of India that's been infected with feminism, and women now think that they can just like change bad people through compassion and kindness. And someone described this phenomenon as like something like the nature of not knowing danger, or like the danger of not knowing. And like this is now becoming a problem because the women have been infected with this idea, and it's making them incredibly stupid, to the point where like I don't know why this idea is so potent that it can make women not see danger in men, which has historically been, I think if you were to just like pitch to your ancestors that the idea that men can be made better through kindness would be considered insane. How it's taken idea in our society, I have no idea. Like, even just like from a visual perspective, I think it's completely nuts.
Kindness becomes a substitute for the reality of sexuality, and childbearing, right? So there is something, I think, to the domestication of men by their wives, and that's a taming force, right? So it's the attachment, the bonding of a man to a woman, the two becoming one. You'll often see that too. I see that in my own marriage times too, where you as a husband become the sharp tip of the sword that your wife sends out into the world to establish boundaries for the family, right? So she knows you become the weapon that she wields on her behalf, right? And this is often the times the way that you see it played out in society, but now it's not a husband-wife, it's not localized. In the context of a village, women are directing the politics through their husbands, right? And that's kind of how it's worked for time immemorial. And this is one of those things that you see. Whereas, like having a wife, having children, I think restrains the violence, because now the violence within men, because now he's got something to live for. He doesn't necessarily, as a young unmarried man, it isn't all about just seeking glory on the margins, in fending off the enemy. He has something to come back to. Right.
I never thought of it.
I think that's a big dynamic.
I never thought of what you just said about how women should treat their husbands as, I always focus on more the maternal instincts rather than how they treat their husbands. But that nurturing function of adults is also like weirdly mixing with the infantile desire to mold children. And it's sort of in this really weird way how you described is it sort of fluctuates in this really weird, twisted, intertwining way that they treat men as both like potential husband materials, but also their own children in a way that is really, really creepy. Like,
it can be. Well, especially for unmarried women. Like married women tend to avoid this because they have a husband, right? So now they have an outlet for
that energy goes to, there's an outlet for that kind of
the energy goes to taming their husband, right? And so and you can see this with young girls when they practice on their fathers, right? So it's the father becomes their first boyfriend. So you learned how to manipulate men by manipulating your father.
Yeah, daddy's princess, right?
right? Yeah. And then you go out into the world. And so those skills that you learn, then you go out into the world, and then you can take those skills that you learned manipulating your own father by watching your mother manipulate your dad. Then you go, I think, and I mean, I know I'm casting it into very harsh light. Like, these are good things. This is like how society has worked for as long as there's been history. And
don't say,
a lot
don't
of
say
modernity disrupts this. Sorry, go ahead.
Don't say manipulation, say influence.
Influence. That's right. Yeah.
That's a better word.
Now, in a disordered way, it can be, it can be manipulation, but if it's disordered, but in a healthy way, it's influence. Right. So, and then they influence each other. But there's also a sense where there's things that men give women. I think the man's role is to stabilize a woman's emotions, and he becomes her rock. Right. And so, that
is becoming increasingly difficult in our society because women appear to be completely insane. I feel like the reason why that's very difficult for my generation to do, and essentially some of the up and comers, is because usually the way society would work is that you present yourself as an accruer of resources and a protector. And this is what you use to essentially peacock to women that you are something that can pass on their genes. Your resources is to open up the sexual marketplace. In reality, that's like basically 101 of mating rituals. And so if you disrupt this signal by saying, well, I can already gather resources, the women no longer become an object of potential mating material. Now they just become like essentially a sex object. It's become commodification. And I think that once women realize or get the impression that they're not valued for that kind of prospects and you're just kind of a toy to screw around with, they also don't really see their value in anything as far as a stable relationship anchor is concerned and value outside of just that, which is where they have this really strange sort of commodification kind of mentality. As they also say feminism has empowered us. Well, it's quite weird because I remember feminism was women are more than just their bodies, and now women are empowered by being sex workers. And that's the kind of shit that men go, you women are idiots because you're just contradicting. And after a while, men will stop caring because like women make no fucking sense. And if you're a man, the main thing that you like is to make sense. And when women don't make sense, it makes them mad to the point of disengaging.
But yeah, and this is where I think the longhouse thing comes in, is that the energy that would have otherwise been directed towards children and managing the household, the same skills that come from managing all of these things, are now brought out into the work world. And men provide for women this beautifully efficient, technologized system of governance, managerialism, the policy framework. And women can then use this to essentially outlet their need to the motherhood need to raising children. So they're in a sense mothering men, their children, but the outlet they have for it is not in the household. The outlet for it is in government and business.
Yeah.
In the broader society. And I think, women are remarkably capable. Basically. And given this right, in many ways, I think the managerial system is much, much more suited to women than it is to men. Because the managerial system stifles, and this I think is where, go back into our conversation before we went on air. I think this is where, in a sense, BAP is on to something, that men are incredibly stifled in the managerial system, because what the managerial system tries to do is to create consistent, predictable, efficient outcomes. And you're trying to eliminate the variance in quality of persons by making up for that with system. So what you can do is you can take away all of you can employ a larger number of people at a greater number of tasks that their own abilities wouldn't allow them to do, by creating a policy framework that enables them to operate. So basically the policies tell them what to do, and you don't have to sit on them and spend a huge amounts of energy. You can just train them to operate within the policy network, follow the flowcharts, and if they can't follow the flowcharts, to get their manager. The cost of raising the floor in this regard, though, is that you also cut off the peaks. And so I think what BAP is getting at is that the reason why they want to, in a sense, sweep away the present order to rediscover this vital past is that men are recognizing that you're trapped in this order where the heroic is actually forbidden. Like, not so much even the heroic, but
the
dynamic
daring.
quality men cannot succeed because the managerial system prevents them from doing that intentionally. It does not want the leader figure because the leader figure is inherently threatening, because the leader figure implies then if we allow this variance in quality, then we also have to allow the variance at the bottom end. And so the cost for the variance at the top is the thing is we take away all of that high end energy, success, innovation, all of that. And this is also another reason why managerialism, moves society into a period of mediocrity, is because it does so intentionally, because it wants consistent, maybe slightly above average outcomes consistently. It doesn't want greatness because greatness is inherently a threat to consistency, if that makes sense.
So, yeah, so you are in essence trying to cull creative chaos in the name of predictable stability.
That's right. Yes. And raising productivity to create consistent. Yes. And you can do this in everything from manufacturing to education to healthcare to government. All across the board, what you're looking for is consistent, predictable outcomes. And so the whole system becomes directed towards
rigid and stiff.
Yes, rigid and stiff. Mm-hmm. And so then, and this then dovetails back into the appeal of why, in this sense, the fascism appeal. So this, or maybe perhaps the right word is not fascism, but what we might call past utopianism. So what you do is you pick up a history book and you read about these great figures, the great Greek heroes, as Bab does, and you say, wow, these great Greek heroes, these are inspiring men. So what we need to do is create bands, like pirate bands of inspiring men, and go into raiding society and taking, war brides and all the rest. You know what I mean? We need to behave like these old pirate, these old raiding parties used to behave, and that will free us as men. So what he's basically saying is that, without necessarily saying it, is we need to sweep away the present order and reinstantiate this heroic past, and things will be good again. Now, but the
revolutionary Greeks.
Yes, exactly. But the thing is that in the modern context, you're not actually being real Greeks. You're not actually being real barbarians. What you're doing is you're doing the modern thing. So you're saying, what are the essential characteristics of this heroic past? Let's analyze it, break it down, abstract it, rationalize it, and then we can develop it into a plan that will allow us to disrupt the system. But what you've done is basically what the system is already doing, because this is what the system does, is it takes life, it examines it, abstracts it, rationalizes it, and turns it into a plan. But what you're saying is that we need to sweep away the present order, and we need to have this new plan, that this new plan will allow us to have the heroic. So if we reinstantiate kings, but we can't because they're not created organically. So we create a simulacrum of a king, which is the dictator. So if we have hierarchy, so we'll reimpose a nobility on people, but you're not having a real nobility. You just have a simulacrum of nobility because all you've done is analyze what nobility used to be, and you've come up with a series of principles, and now you're going to instantiate it like a technique. And so this kind of sort of right-wing or quote-unquote right-wing thing is thoroughly and fundamentally modern and participates in all of the same myths and habits of doing things as does the current managerial system. But it's just looking to find from the past a set of principles that it can reinstantiate as a kind of, if we manage to do that, this will enable us to get the modern project right, if that makes sense. This is what will fix it, and this is what will usher in a utopia. But it's still a utopian project, and it's still very much modern.
So you basically want to create the exterior of the Ferrari without the engine that made it move.
Yeah, but it just doesn't. You're creating a simulacrum. So in a sense, like take for example television, right? Little House on the Prairie. Okay, like Little House on the Prairie is not real prairie life. You're not watching real prairie life. You're watching a Hollywood set. And in some sense, this is what fascism does. It creates a Hollywood set of an ancient culture and tries to, but people glom onto it because and Schmidt was right about this, is that these myths appeal to people far more than the abstractions that class do. The average person, class is much more of an elitist thing. That's the funny thing is that Marxism appeals to the elites and fascism appeals to the average man, because the average man resonates with the hero type. And so you've given him this abstract form, and now you're trying to reinstantiate it in modernity, but it's a thoroughly modern project. So it's like watching Little House on the Prairie. You're not watching real prairie life. You're watching a simulacrum of prairie life. And so this is what you get then, is a simulacrum of an organic hierarchical culture. And that's, in a sense, and this is where you went with mid-century German. It's thoroughly technological. It's thoroughly modern. It's not ancient, and it's very much a modernist project. And so it's what you call, it's reactionary or past revolution. This is what Del Noce calls past revolutionary. So I've been doing a lot of talking here, but that's kind of, I think, why, in some sense, there really is no right wing in the modern era, right? But yet at the same time, I think your framing of what conservative is or right wing is, I think, is ultimately correct. But I'm not sure how the sense of getting there is the question.
Yeah, I don't. Considering you said it doesn't exist in the present day and age, like the descriptions are there, it makes me think that to be a right wing in today's society would be considered quite revolutionary.
Yeah, or reactionary. You're a counter-revolutionary in some sense. You're a reactionary.
Oh yeah.
But at the same time, and this is why I think, like somebody like, say, Václav Havel, he says, and he recognized this tension, right? He says, if you're an anti-communist, your whole life becomes defined by communism, by being anti-communist, right? And so
yeah, that's true.
There's a sense, he says, well, what you really need to do is just do the right thing and let the results come as they may. Speak for themselves. Yeah. And there is a sense, and I think this is why, for me, parallelism is a thing. Because the only problem is, and this is the downside, is if you say, okay, let's sweep away the present order, bring everything back, and in 600 years, a new organic society will emerge. Because that's kind of what you're asking for, right? If you want a real organic conservative society to move, you just get rid of modernity, throw people back into the dark ages, quote unquote dark ages, and just let them start over again. I mean, this is like every, Bond villain that's ever existed,
it's the Year Zero experiment.
That's right. It's basically, and so it's like, to me, this is not a legitimate political program. If you want to do the Bond villain thing, this is not a legitimate political program. You're just not serious.
That's,
Yeah.
Yeah, but
like billions must die. I don't think is a credible,
okay, but oh god, like I'm trying to say this and skirt within the TOS. It's my main. Yeah, it's because I feel like I'm kind of like on a board and I'm trying to move towards certain points, but this is going to go like, here you have Pinochet, here you have Franco, here you have Uncle Adolf. I'm like, okay, I don't want to go through any one of these doors, but like if I go in this direction, like this is what I'm seeing as I'm moving towards in that direction. Like my ultimate endpoint is sort of these people that we already have. My main concern is that I don't think you're actually going to get through this without some hint of violence.
Oh,
because that's the case with every society. Yes, but like I don't actually think that's I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think that's more inevitable.
Yes, but from a moral perspective, there's a great difference between it's inevitable and it just happened and I caused it to happen.
It's being forced. Yeah, but
is that? I think that's
Okay, now the reason why I think people will find that kind of hazy is because some people will think, well, if this is the inevitable destination anyway, why not go with full acceleration and just do it now?
The Nick Land solution.
Just
and push on the gas. Let's go, baby.
Yeah, I also, from a purely pragmatic perspective, I can sort of understand the people that want to do it now, because if they look at it in the trajectory and go, in the future, our chances of winning is less. So if you do it now, you have a better chance of winning. Because that, pragmatically speaking, does make sense.
No.
Unfortunately.
No, and here's the other thing, though, Spoon, that I think that a lot of people don't grapple adequately with. Okay, it's not like what kind of catastrophe would have to happen where people completely and utterly forget about the technologies that we have? Like, how bombed into the dark ages do you have to be, right? Like, so in this sense, I say to people that the problem with technology is fundamentally a moral problem of restraint. Right now, there's a whole, but there is a sense where getting at an organic culture again, that you are going to have to confront the problem of technique relative to the organic. And you're going to have to draw boundaries to say that we're not going to go down this road because we know that it destroys our society fundamentally. And we're just not going to go there. But at the same time, and this is what I've called it to other people, like the tank problem. You know, there might be a people down there, like in the neighboring land, that without these kind of scruples, and they think, screw it, like we can build tanks and run over everybody, right? All these people that are like restraining technology, like good for them, but we're going to go and dominate them because like we have no problem with using tanks, right? And so this is the fundamental problem that you have in a world of sin and evil, that there are.
And we have nukes.
Well, no, but see, what there's the idea, like, what if you say, well, nuclear stuff is easy, we're going to live like Mennonites, and like, well, that's just a dumb solution, because the only reason the Mennonites can live like Mennonites is because America has nukes, right? If they have to protect themselves from America, then that's a very, very different equation. Like so there is this sense where I think a lot of people have not sufficiently grappled with that. The other thing is to just simply accept, or do you just simply say that nihilism is the baseline for society now, and we just have to like accept the fact that everything is artificial, constructed in a simulacrum, and somehow within the simulacrum you have to pierce the veil, the enframing, and find something that is genuine, metaphysically and ontologically real. And that might, to me, I think there might be, I don't know, because I think that the power of the system to corrupt you is just so great that you like, how do you escape? Because its effects, like the kind of effects that the nihilism of a deconstructed simulacrum have, like, how do you, like, a question that, as a Christian, how do you find God in a simulacrum? Right? This is the kind of thing that I grapple with every day in my life. Right? How do you find God in a simulacrum?
I would imagine through community, certainly not your own.
And that's where you come back to kind of the third way, right? In a sense of like, can we, in the midst of this simulacrum, build a real community that is able to actually, I hate the word authentic, but is able to actually encounter the divine again, or able to actually encounter the world, like the real metaphysical world as it is, without layers of constructs in between and concepts defined, where we can just go out and make things with our hands again, or whatever, or contact physical reality and metaphysical reality without the construct of modernity having abstracted, rationalized, analyzed it, and imposed it back upon us.
So return to monkey, basically.
Well, not monkeys, because we're not monkeys. We're created in the image of God. But
this is the kind of thing, right? In the return to nature state, not really the literal return to monkey mode. Well, I'm not saying go full Tarzan.
Too, I mean, this is again too, though. This is another problem, right? So now we're looping back to, like, there's no new stories here, right? So you get to like Tolstoy and the death of Ivan Ilyich, right? Where where he idolizes the peasant boy. Right. And the peasant boy is the one that's going to save him. Well, the peasant boy isn't going to save you. Right. Because the peasant boy is a peasant boy for a reason. And Ivan Ilyich is, a high powered judge for a reason. Again, we get down to natural hierarchies. Right. So you can, and I think this is one of the conceits of the modern world, that we idealize peasant life. Yeah. So how can we be modern people without idealizing the peasant, having a real authentic connection to an actual past set of traditions, the metaphysical and the physical world around us, without it being, how do we break the frame, so to speak, the enframing of that the modern world puts on us? Because everything within the modern world tends to pull us back to this, technologized world, or where we're trying to live some fantasy life of some idealized peasant that we're then going to reinstantiate by sweeping away the modern order, which is again another form of the past utopianism. Like the world of Tolkien Shire is closed off to us. Like the world of Tolkien Shire is closed off to us, and it was closed off to Tolkien too. But it's so that's the problem that we face. I've been doing a lot of talking here today. This is one of them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. I don't think you can return to the Garden of Eden, essentially.
No,
but you can try and recreate it.
Yeah. So, what does going forward look like? I think this is the real question, right? Without falling into the temptation of Marx again, where we have to sweep away the present order to the Christianity.
Do you think maybe the return to a monarchy is maybe not is a version of going forward? Because I mean, the return to monarchies has happened throughout all of human history. It's not exactly old.
No, but I think that it would have to come. A return to genuine monarchy, like an organic monarchy, would.
Why do you consider
during a period of great social dislocation where somebody steps into the breach, and like a great man steps into the breach, organizes people, saves them, and then proves his worth, that in a sense the hand of God is with him in that regard.
Do we consider a return to? It's quite weird to me that it's considered a return, because a return almost sounds like it's been abandoned and it's been rediscovered. Whereas I don't really like that framing, because it sounds like it's going backwards. And I don't.
Yeah, it is going backwards, and I think that's the impulse is to go backwards. I think that's Bap's fundamental problem, is that it's nostalgic. He's looking nostalgically back as the Greeks and saying, if we could just be like the Greeks, that would save us from all of the ills. That would save from the ills of modernity.
See, I don't quite view it like that, because that sort of implies that the reason I would say, from like a technical perspective, the reason I say that is because it sounds like the progress is good, and what we're returning to is something that we've lost, because that's kind of weird, because it also implies that the progress itself is not good. So it's just depending on the framing.
The question of like, what is progress, right? And that's the other question. We haven't really defined what is progress.
Well, progress always is considered good, because progress is always considered moving forward. But moving forward off a fucking cliff is not good. Yeah, exactly. But it wasn't always
that way, though, Spoon. Like, it was the world was largely static, and progress was considered vertical, moving upwards to God. Like, that was like 600 years ago. That was normal. That progress meant moving upwards to God.
Progress, in my mind, seems to be technological
and modern. So the idea of human progress is fundamental. And then we've developed a series of cosmological origin stories and framing. So evolution becomes the cosmological frame that supports human progress.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. So here's the thing I was going to say too. I think one of the things that Christianity does is, in some sense, it resolves the problem of sweeping away the present order for us as human beings, because it places the sweeping away of the present order into God's hand. So in a sense, the day of judgment and the new heaven and the new earth. So there is this sense that when God has deemed it time, he is going to sweep away the present order. And then instead, and in the meantime, you do the best you can in a sinful world, and you try to ascend closer to God, and to reveal in a sense, reveal who you're going to be in this new godly order today by ascending to God. But you're not moving, quote unquote, forward along the line of history. And this is why history is a dangerous idea in the sense of the Hegelian progressive sense of history.
Yeah, essentially you're making a CV for God, if you can put it that way.
Yeah.
I should use that metaphor more often. That's not a bad one, actually. But,
and this, I think, is why Christianity has endured, because in a sense, it steps out of the modern framing to offer a way through. That's modern framing, but it offers an alternative to the modern progressive framing that is inherent at the very substrate of modernity, and that all modern ideologies are subject to, in a sense of sort of the as Eliade calls it, the burden of history, right? So all modern quote unquote solutions are subject to the burden of history, in the sense that we have to save ourselves. Whereas the Christian faith says, no, that's beyond us. We're just going to muddle along and do the best we can. But ultimately, fixing things is God's problem. And we're just going to trust that he's going to take care of it.
I would say, if I was going to go back to...
Modernity has said, we don't trust God. We're going to take care of it ourselves. That's the fundamental argument for modernity. Really.
I would say, if I was going to return to a sort of stable tradition, I would ask a fundamental question of why are we here, and what is a good life to each civilization? Because I feel like that kind of depends on what your civilization values, and your concept of glory depends on that. Essentially, what do your men do? Because I feel like in our timeline, it's just chase money. It's very resource gathering intensive. Quite basic bitch, actually, if I think about it. Because if you take like a concept, if you take like a culture that's very warlike, like say Vikings, what makes a Viking glory is Valhalla and battle, which is fair enough. That's kind of like Bronze Age pervert, like if it was like basically the Scandinavians, right? So I can understand that. But what would be like a good life to say, like a hobbit in the Shire, a giant garden, and mead.
Well, yeah. Well, the garden is actually the Christian answer, and I think, and this is one of the reasons why I think, in the end, that Christianity has a civilizing effect on the German, that sort of violent German spirit, right? Is that, and they were able, although you never really get rid of the Germanic spirit, but Christianity takes the external battle of man versus man and spiritualizes it. So in a sense, your battle is not with flesh and blood, but with it. So in a sense, now you are engaged in God's cosmic battle with the devil, right? So there is a sense that you are engaged in a spiritual war, but also then you're engaged in the battle with yourself to ascend to God. So the true man is the one who has mastered himself, or maybe better, allowed God to master him. You know what I mean? He's been trained by God to be master of, in a sense, he's a godly man. And so that ascending that ladder of being to God and being mastered by God, or being taught by God in that regard, and then you become a weapon in this cosmic spiritual war, good versus evil. Now, you can see this because we never really escape the sinful world. So the world of violence and so forth is always there. But the idea, especially in the Western tradition, of the knight monk. So the knight monk who has his violence restrained by his monastic vows, but then he becomes a warrior for God against the enemies of God that oppose the Christian people within the bounds of history. Right. So you bring those two ideas together. Now, it's not, in a sense, you would say, like, you could argue, well, that's not purely Christian. And I think there's something right to that. But there is a sense of, like, okay, if you're going to instantiate it in the Germanic people, this may be as good as you're going to get.
Yeah, because there's a sense of value in a moral code that you're trying
to
instill.
And you're never going to overcome, like, in a sinful world, you're never going to overcome that fully. But so in a sense, the best you can do it, in a sense, restrain it and give it a purpose. Right?
Yeah, you're essentially
you accept the downside of the violence, which really ideally that's, from a Christian perspective, God didn't intend the world to be violent and so forth. So, but you're now going to take this violence and again, you set these men up on the boundary of a Christian kingdom and say, we're going to protect it so that the rest of us can then pursue virtue and the to go up the ladder being towards God. So you can create a whole society then by these men standing on the boundary and being like the watchmen.
Yeah, you're essentially trying to like recreate a holy warrior.
Yeah. And they have a task, which is to stand on the boundary to protect the Christian kingdom.
Yes. Because every society needs its warriors.
At least in a sinful world, they do. Yeah.
Yes. Because I don't think we're going to be, all holier than thou anarchists anytime soon.
Well, yeah, and until God comes and sweeps away the present order and instantiates the new heaven and the new earth, and that's I think this so this is really where I think, and I think the historicization, the immanentization of Christian eschatology has been very problematic because now you've taken what was essentially God's action and you said, no, you wait, we as Christian people are going to sweep away the present order and instantiate the new heaven and the new earth. Go ahead.
I would say the main problem of our society is we want to have Christian values without any Christian ethics.
Well, yes, but we want to have it without having to do all the messy work.
Yes.
Actually drawing close to God.
Yes. Or even just having any kind of imposition.
Yeah. So you abstract it and you say, well, what would, in our mind, what would somebody who really has a close relationship with God, who is really a godly person, like the saint, how would he live? Let's abstract this. And then let's turn this into a set of value propositions that we can then make into a series of policies that we can then impose back onto society. But we don't necessarily need the real thing. We don't need the mystic at the core of it because we've got the principles. That's what the modern world looks at. Yeah, go ahead.
I would say, in essence, what they're trying to do, based on what you just said, is almost like a weird, like a Christianized version of blank slate theory. Like this is like best case scenario, which is that assuming that people can understand these values, we can impose upon them without the use of force, which you can maybe do, but then you need a reason for why those values need to exist. Like my main thing that I sort of see in people is that they can get behind the values, but they don't actually know what those values are supposed to do other than production.
Yes, because that's how they've been framed. That's how the modern world has framed it. That it's
yes.
Yeah.
But like I said, those values that you're trying to impose now that the state seems to have taken advantage of, they're not actually good for the goal that you even want them to be. They're actually destructive. So that's why I'm like, this is why the machine doesn't go anywhere and why it's going off the rails, is because like the main things that you actually want to do is actually not what it's going to end up doing.
Well, but you also you turn it into a product that you can use to build. And this is part of the problem with the quote unquote church growth movement, is that you take these value propositions and say, if you, in quote unquote, buy this product, like buy into this product, we can give you the good life. And
it's
so
very culty.
Well, culty, but it's a technologized version of the faith in a sense of you've turned essentially a spiritual thing into a materialist into materialist form. In a sense, we're going to try to satisfy your spiritual needs materially, and we're going to do it using a simulacrum of the Christian faith. This is kind of where we're at, those booms. And this is where part of, like, now we're getting these things that, like, the hearts of my criticisms of a lot of stuff that way too. But that's essentially, I think, where a good chunk of the Christian faith is today, that, we have turned it into a product that if you buy into this product, it's a material thing that we can meet all of your needs materially in this simulacrum of a real living mystical Christian faith. And then you don't have to give up any of the things of the modern world. You can keep on producing and consuming and doing all the rest of it, and you're good to go. And you never have to challenge. Yeah. And that's, in a sense, you're fully good to go for the modern Western world. and this Christian bit thing here that we've distilled and turned into a series of principles, this can give you everything you need to make you a maximum producer. They don't put it in that phrase, but that's basically what's being happened.
Yeah. Someone asked me that a while ago. They asked me, like, do I think that the current reemergence of Christianity in the West is good? And I said, I don't think it's genuine because it feels like a reaction to something rather than an organic growth.
Well, it is and it isn't. There's a lot of good people, good men, and I think there's many who really want and they desire it deeply because of the nihilism in today's state. They desperately want it, but they don't actually know how to get there for the most part. Because again, they approach it from a thoroughly modern perspective. And again, they boil it down to, let's abstract create the principles that we need. And if we impose these principles on ourselves and on society.
Peterson is a good example of that.
Sorry, go ahead.
Jordan Peterson is a good example of that.
Yes. Yeah, and he gets
feel
roundly
like
criticized.
His journey is. I also feel like it's. I almost feel like, again, this is not meant to be a criticism of anyone in particular, but I feel like technology does not help because the way that people get any kind of credibility in our society is through the internet and through exposure. And I feel like them trying to hop onto Christianity is making it a fad rather than something that's genuine. And I don't like that.
No, it's just more
posturing.
It's the latest thing.
Yeah, it's also commercializing it.
Yeah, you've turned it into a product, and this has happened long ago. Like Christianity was prepared for the Instagram era long before the Instagram ever arrived. So long before social media was here, Christianity has been well prepared for this moment.
Yeah, maybe I'm actually being a bit harsh with the people because I know like Protestantism was highly valued by more the aristocratic class when it first broke out.
I think the things that the people hunger are valid. Like they want the right stuff. They just don't know how to get there. And all they know is a technologized world. And so they just come at it from what they know. Right. And this comes back to something we were talking about before we went on air, is that we like to hear messages that are in the bounds of what we know and conform to the fundamental myths of modernity. They make us feel good
because we recognize
and they work with propaganda. But if somebody tells you the things that you don't really want to hear or don't resonate with the fundamental values of the Western world, they don't sell. And so nobody wants them because it's not that they're even closed-minded to it. They don't, like you say, they don't sell. And this again gets back to the whole thing of why, even though we can describe and we can kind of get a feel for what the traditional societies, the kind of thing that Burke talked about, right? Of, a customary society, have hundreds of years of people who have kind of just patiently worked out among themselves. This is the right way to live. It's an amalgam of personal experience, faith, the context of their own environment, and they just intuitively know this is the way we do things around here. Some of it can be articulated verbally, and a lot of it is wisdom and judgment. And we can but even now, even saying it out loud and articulating it doesn't mean that you have it. And then trying to instantiate it by means of using technique, you basically destroy it. And that's kind of the dilemma, is that within the context of the modern world, everything in some ways becomes progressive in that regard, because fundamental things that we can, the blank slateism, the progressivism, the we can perfect societyism, all that kind of stuff.
Kind of reminds you of the imposition of education.
Yes.
Yeah.
You can impose education. It becomes part of the system.
Yes. And also it is just a piece of code that assumes everyone has the same hardware. Is it assumes everyone has the same hardware capable of taking the same software, which is just that's just deadly stupid. Like if I think about buying theory for more than 10 seconds, this is like genuinely insane. Or very stupid, because it's never met any other human. The idea that you can just make somebody else's values by giving them tools is like.
Yes, but you look around you though, Spoon, and look at we've come by imposing that basic idea. Now, we see a whole bunch of problems that have been generated by it, but like we've managed to create like the medicine, the money. I mean, like you have a world expanding empire, the weapons, the technology, the vast amounts of wealth, the ability to, all of these things that people point to are real, right? And they've been produced because of system and technique. We can impose a system, and maybe not everybody. I mean, they make everybody, but that we can can function productively in this world if we impose.
Stupid and miserable.
Well, not so much empty, and their nihilism. Passive is definitely true. It's made them passive. When you have a system imposed upon you from without, it's definitely going to make you passive. Also, emptied it of anything that is. Nihilism is the way to go. And people don't realize, most people are so like the Matrix. They're so plugged into the Matrix that they're filling it with because that's the thing that's kept is allowed to see just how empty their life is.
The material world, despite the fact that it has all these technological benefits, increase in production and wealth, but it's actually made you more too.
Yeah, like you're a simulacrum of a real person.
Yes, and what's quite basics of gather resources to produce offspring. Basic mammals do. We don't even do that. Which, how is everything around us more sophisticated? I can't explain that. That to me is just mind-boggling. So if someone were to ask me that, I would go, I actually can't answer that question. It's very strange. Or for anyone, because I don't.
Wow.
It seems to me like the best I can offer is maybe that people are more obsessed with actually genuine enlightenment and a kind
of for the thing that they're actually missing, right? So, and that's gone.
Okay, this is going to sound a bit screwed up, but I found I don't mean this in a is in a segregated sense, in the sense that they want to in their surroundings because of its being and people feel like displaced in their own land. Yes, I think that's one of the reasons why society is so fucked. Is a desire for their own kin, and European to the point where response. And my worry is that because it is gory because
it's
we don't.
This is again why you set up boundaries, and so metropolitan, right? But
yeah,
generally society, and you set up boundaries for a reason, and so it potentially be enemies. I mean, they could. You're in a sinful world. If you bring enough in a society, because you don't really get multicultural culture and a few. But when you have stable minority, or there is no dominant minority, don't like each other, then because the only thing that kept you was gone, well, Yugoslavia and very blood for us that may be the it really something dumb like mass immigration.
Hypothetically speaking, he said the only time you have black unity, historically speaking, and we are like being hated, really, really fucked up.
There is, unfortunately, yeah.
This is why people don't want to. Yeah. Culturalism is that culturalism, but you need to have essentially there needs to be a reason for them to use. If you give them by some, because now you need to look at the and far better than other. Fall to pieces, and you go like,
is project from these rewards. Yeah,
incentive.
And
yeah.
Can't